Hello folks, Russell Conte here with the Soapbox. Today I want to show you how to make a piped buttonhole. So without further ado, let's get right to it. To prepare for a piped buttonhole, we're going to mark our garment first. I like to indicate center front, and then I want to mark my placement for the vertical position of the buttonholes. These are going to be horizontal on the garment. This is going to be for a vest or a jacket. When I'm providing for my buttonhole length, I want to make certain that it can accommodate the shank of my button or the depth of it. I want to make certain that the buttonhole is a little bit longer than the button itself so that it accommodates. The other thing I'm going to make certain to do is I'm going to come forward on the buttonhole 1/8 of an inch closer to the edge from center front. So I'm not going to end the buttonhole at center front. I'm going to come to the right of it or to the left of it 1/8 of an inch so that it's closer to the edge of the garment. The reason that we create the buttonhole so that it's 1/8 of an inch beyond center front is so that the button can sit on center front. Otherwise, if I finished it at center front, it'd be sitting next to it and we'd lose a little bit of lateral ease on the garment. Then we're going to use a narrow foot. We're going to use a left or right piping foot. That's a foot that looks like this. It's got a little groove cut out of it so that it can accommodate the needle, and then I can sew my piping very close to the edge. There's a left and a right version. It doesn't matter which one you use. You just have to determine which one's going to be suitable for the way you're working on the machine. I'm also going to need piping and a piping cover. Okay. The piping I use is an 1/8 inch wide, and the piping cover I'm going to cut it 1 1/4 inches, and I'm going to cut that on bias. And I would say per button, depending on the length of your button, give yourself another inch. So if you've got an inch size button, give yourself 2 inches for each piece of welt or piping you're going to use. So you use about 4 inches per buttonhole. That's more than you'll need, but it's better to have a little too much than too little. So we're piping into our piping cover. I think of it like a hot dog and a bun. We want that hot dog right in the middle of the bun, and we want those raw edges to match up. If they don't match up while you're sewing, what will happen is you'll get some twist, and later on that will show up in the edge of your piping, so you don't want that to occur. So make certain you keep those raw edges as tidy as possible. Get this on the machine, and I'm going to snug it up to the foot, bring the foot down to it, and then adjust as I need to. So you'll see that sitting in the middle. We'll place this so that the raw edges are matching up. And we'll sew it. Now a little trick here so that you can get right next to the piping is don't sew straight onto it. So don't keep your fabric directly in front of it. I always nudge it to the right or left ever so slightly. So in this case I'm sewing on the left side, so I'm going to nudge it to the right. That way this foot will kind of bank off the piping and get really tight into the edge. Once I've created my piping, I'm going to go ahead and cut it to length. You only need about a 1/4 inch excess on either side, but too much is not a problem. You can always cut it away later on, so don't be skimpy. I'm going to leave myself about a 1/2 inch on either side. Right. Now here's the tricky part. We want to align this stitching line so that it lands about 1/8 of an inch away from our center. And when we're sewing it, we want to sew it precisely end to end, just like we would a welt pocket or another bound buttonhole. But we also want to make certain that we're pressing hard against that piping so that if we can cover that prior stitching. We want that to be as snug as possible. I'm preparing to sew my first piping into my buttonhole. And again, I want to make certain that when I'm sewing it about 1/8 of an inch away from the center line of the buttonhole. That 1/8 on this side and the 1/8 on the other side will give us the space that we need to turn this so that the welts or the piping sit towards center successfully and cleanly. I also want to make certain I'm sewing precisely end to end, just like I would with a welt pocket or a bound buttonhole. My trick also is I decrease my stitch length, so if my standard stitch length for this would be about 2 millimeters, I'll take it to about 1.6 at the very beginning and the very end, and frankly for the entire length of the buttonhole I do that. When I begin sewing, I'm going to begin sewing in about 3 or 4 stitches from the edge. I'm going to back up first, and then I'm going to come forward. When I get to the other end, I'm going to conclude my stitching, and then I'm going to back up 3 or 4 stitches and take the project off of the machine. Again, we want to be as snug to the piping as possible, so be very mindful of that. But we sew on the first piece, and I have been able to get closer to my piping. I want to sew as close to that piping as possible. And so my prior stitch line, which is right there, will actually be hidden by my new stitch line. I've sewn from end to end precisely, and I've sewn 1/8 of an inch away from my centerpiece, or my cut line for the buttonhole itself. Now we're ready to attach the second piece. To prepare our second side, we're going to lift the edge of the piping up. We're going to set the other one right next to it. Now this is why using that narrow foot is very important. The finish will actually be 1/4 of an inch, but I want to make certain my foot is narrow enough to be able to accommodate so I can actually sew between. So again, we pull this out of the way, we place that other piece right next to it, and there's going to be just enough foot for the sewing machine to slide right through there with that narrow foot. My first piece of piping has been sewn into place. I have placed my second piece, and I've left just enough space between the two so they can turn inside. So that's going to be about 1/4 of an inch on the inside because these are each 1/8 of an inch finished. And then I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from that center point. So my cut line here on the pocket, a little difficult to see, and it can be a little awkward here when you're getting in here because you've got both these tails of fabric that you need to lift up and out of the way. So I've lifted this one on the first one out of the way. The second one's going to be lifted up as well. And I'm going to start again in about 4 stitches, 3 or 4 stitches. I'm going to stay as snug to that piping as possible. And then I'm going to come forward. When I get to the other end, I'm going to backstitch 3 or 4 stitches and take the work off the machine. So that's what it's going to look like. You're going to have those 2 tags of fabric, the tails left over, and that space between. You can't see this very well on this side, but there's about 1/4 inch on either side. And then what we'll do is we'll cut it like we would a bound buttonhole or a welt pocket, and then we'll flip to the other side. I'll show you that in just a moment. I'm going to open this buttonhole the same way I would a bound buttonhole or a welt pocket. I'm going to find the center, and I'm going to cut through the center, and I'm going to stop about 1/4 inch before the ends on either side, and I'm going to cut up on a diagonal to the stitching but not through it, and then down on the diagonal to the stitching and not through it. Be very careful about that. You'll have a little triangle here, and you'll do the same triangle cut over here. Then we're ready to turn it to the other side. Got it cut, now we're ready to turn it to the other side. We're going to bring these layers all the way through. And that's what it will look on the inside. Here's how it looks on the outside. That little triangle that we need to make sure it stays inside. We're going to press him back out. And there we have it. And what we want to do is take it over to the iron and give it a nice press to make sure this lays nice and tidy. Once I've sewn the piping into the buttonhole, I'm ready to catch these triangles too. You'll see there's a little triangle there. We want to lift that away, and we want to sew from point to point on the triangle. On that side, and then we'll close that end of it, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. And my pipe buttonhole is complete. I'm going to check it on the sample to verify that my button fits successfully, and it does, and there's no fatigue, and then there's just enough to the right of center front that it can actually sit on center front very nicely. In the next video I'll show you how to attach it to the lining so you have a nice clean finish. Hey folks, thanks for joining me at the Soapbox today. I hope you found the sewing tutorial very helpful. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any fashion I can. In the meantime, have a great day sewing.